Happy Independence Day! Today's episode is particularly timely and poignant as we celebrate our 4th of July holiday in the United States. We welcome Michael Hingston as our guest. He's an extraordinary human who's been blind since birth. And today, he shares his incredible story of escaping the World Trade Center with his guide dog, Roselle. He offers insights for parents of children with disabilities. He will shift your perspective on disabilities and how you can empower your children to thrive. Today's inspirational guest will tell firsthand what his parents did that helped him be strong, independent, and enabled in the presence of disability. Michael declares, whether a disability is present or not, the fact of the matter is that every child, every person has gifts. And as parents, you need to let those gifts develop in your child, and you need to help encourage them. You will surely learn something from today. I know I did. So grab your cup of coffee and enjoy this story. Happy Independence Day. Does your child have a speech-language delay and you really want them to talk? Do difficult behaviors derail home life and you know the frustration is a communication struggle? Does your child see a speech therapist and you wonder, what do they do and how can I help? If these or similar questions are in your mind, this podcast is for you. Hello, my name is Dina Lynn Rosenbush. I am a speech-language pathologist that has worked with children from birth to 21 for 3 decades. And in my classrooms, I see you wanting to connect with the heart of your child, but their speech and language skills create a barrier. So if you have a kiddo that has difficult behaviors, needs to expand their language or learn to say speech sounds, and maybe even receives speech therapy, stay tuned. Because in this podcast, you will learn how to use your daily life as a tool to communication practice and how to do that practice. You will become confident knowing you are making the difference you want to make. And you will hear success stories of parents who have navigated these struggles already. We'll do this all while focusing on building deep, meaningful connection and confidence in your kiddo. So grab a cup of coffee along with a notebook and pen. It's time to speak in the way your child's brain understands. And that is the language of play. Hello, listeners. Here at the Language of Play, we are building our resource deck for you. Be sure to check the show notes to see what is most recently added to our resources. There are many things we're working on right now, and it's exciting to unfold them. And reminder, when you are willing to jump in at the beginning of the offerings, when I'm still learning some details and getting the kinks out, I do offer the first things for free while I can get feedback from you. So be sure to email me at hello@thelanguageofplay if you are willing to be some of my first people. I really, really value the feedback so that I can make it better and better. Now let's listen to today's recorded episode with Michael Hingston. Can you imagine what it would be like to come out of the World Trade Center? Can you imagine what it would be like to do it blind and with a guide dog leading you? Today's speaker will inspire you to look at the problems that you have to be able to think of them differently. Michael Hingston was blind since birth. He was born to sighted parents who raised him with a can-do attitude. Michael rode a bike and learned to do advanced math in his head. He moved to California and attended college, receiving a master's degree in physics and a secondary teaching credential. Mike is the author of the #1 New York Times bestseller, Thunderdog, and then he published a second book, Running with Roselle, and Roselle was his dog that helped him out of the tower. And now he has a third book coming out, Live Like a Guide Dog, which will be published in August of 2024 and can be pre-ordered. Michael Hingston, welcome to the Language of Play. I am so glad you're here today because your story will surely inspire the parents in my audience to think about what they can do for their kiddos, even if their kiddos have disabilities. Welcome to the show.
Well, thank you. And My belief, of course, is everyone has a disability. So people who have the so-called traditional disabilities, whether it's autism, developmental disabilities, blind, deaf, or hard of hearing, or whatever, we all have disabilities. And what we really need to recognize is that all of us have challenges in life. And what we need to do is to not decide how competent or capable someone is just because of a so-called visible or even invisible disability, which is something that all too often society decides to do. That is, make determinations about us without knowing anything about us.
Right. I'm going to highlight that right away. Don't decide the competence of somebody based on the disability. And I agree with you completely, entirely. We wouldn't want our parents to do that about their
Well,
students when they get a disability either. You have a
Well,
phenomenal.
it's like I'm not criticizing, but you mentioned earlier about Roselle leading me out of the World Trade Center. Guide dogs don't lead.
Oh,
That's not their job. They're not the brains of the organization. We're a team, and it's my job to direct the dog. So in the World Trade Center, for example, anyone who listens to my story will learn that I learned what to do in the case of an emergency. And part of the reason for that was so that I could be capable and confident and secure in giving Roselle directions, for example, when I wanted to go to an exit. If I were to let the dog lead and the dog learn how to travel to one particular place to get out of the World Trade Center, what if that place wasn't available because there was fire or something there? What's the
sure.
dog going to do then? That's not the dog's job. And the fact of the matter is that's what I do is direct the dog and make determinations. The dog's job is to make sure that we walk safely. And she depends on me as much as I depend on her. Or now, in case of my current guide dog, Alamo, he depends on me as much as I depend on him because he expects me to know where I want to go and how to get there so that I can give him directions.
That's phenomenal. Tell me how you gave directions down the stairs to get out, knowing, tell me how that works.
Well, in a sense, the same way it works for you. You walk down some stairs and then you look to your left and to your right. You see that you can turn left 180 degrees and walk down the next flight of stairs. And for me, having worked, although not going down all the stairs from the 78th floor to the first floor every day, going up and down stairs, whether it's in the World Trade Center or anywhere else, I know that you go down so many steps, then you get to a landing, and then you have to turn and go down the next flight of stairs. And I give those directions to the dog. So I'll tell Roselle to go forward. We go down a flight of stairs. And then I knew that we had to turn left and then turn left again and then go down the next flight of stairs. It's not magic. The reality is it's the exact same thing you do, except I use slightly different techniques and have slightly different information to get to the same place that you do.
That is so good to think about it from that perspective. When I think of it in language and communication, it makes sense to me. But the truth is, I've never really thought about it with sight. It's not something that I have dealt with. So this
Well,
is
the problem
fascinating.
is we mostly grow up believing that eyesight's the only game in town. Nothing could be worse than losing your eyesight. The Gallup polling organization, for many years in surveying people, found one of the top 5 fears that people had was losing eyesight, not becoming disabled or becoming a person with a disability, which is better terminology, but losing eyesight. Eyesight's not the only game in town. And I'm not saying that I discount eyesight in any way, shape, or form. Some of my best friends are sighted, I love to say. But the reality is, eyesight isn't the only game in town. One of the things that you and I talked about early on that attracted us to doing this was that when I was born and it was discovered I was blind, my parents were told I should be sent to a home because no blind child could ever grow up to amount to anything. The doctors believed that. In other countries, children who were born blind or with any kind of disability were executed on the spot. We don't do that in this country, but at the same time, the attitudes are even to a large degree still there. If your child has a disability, they're less than we are, which is also why when I talk about blindness, I really urge people not to say blind or visually impaired. Visually impaired is a disgusting, derogatory term. Visually, I'm not different simply because I'm blind. If I become blind, I'm not automatically looking different. The other part about it is impaired. I'm not impaired. The impairment is only in societal attitudes. I will do things differently than you do, and I may not have access to all the information that you do for a variety of reasons. But you don't have all the access to all the information that I do as well. As you pointed out, I went through and got a master's degree in physics. I've been in sales. I worked in the World Trade Center, and I escaped because of a variety of things that I knew about what to do as a person who was blind. Blindness isn't the problem, it's societal's attitudes. Disability in general isn't the problem, it's societal attitudes. And it's our lack of allowing society to appropriately prepare to deal with disabilities that tends to be the real issue.
Beautifully said. Really beautifully said. Now, Michael, I would like you to tell the story of how when your parents were told that you wouldn't amount to anything because of your blindness, would you tell the listeners how your parents responded and what awesome things that they did in spite of what they were told?
Well, my parents were told what they were told, and then they said, absolutely not. We can take him home and he's going to grow up to do whatever he chooses to do. We're going to give him that opportunity. It was an incredible leap, a leap that a lot of parents won't take. I know so many blind children whose parents, as the children grew up, sheltered them. They wouldn't let them explore. They wouldn't let them go out at all into the world because they believed you're blind, you can't do stuff. And so they never did. I also know many blind children who, as they grew up, were given the opportunity to explore and grow, and who became a lot more successful and learned a lot more in the way of techniques of how to function as a human being in society. And my parents allowed me to do that. So we were living in Chicago for my first 5 years, and I'd go down to the candy store at the corner, and my parents, I don't even think, supervised me when I went down. I went down with my brother, and usually I went with someone else just because kids do that. But I could walk down to the Fanning's grocery store and get a pretzel or an orange Byerly drink or whatever. And I did that. We moved to California. I learned to ride a bike, rode a bike to school. And I did other things. I went to high school like any other kid, went to college, lived 100 miles away from home, worked at the campus radio station, got a master's degree, and then went into the workforce and was very fortunate to be able to find jobs. I know that some of that had to be a little bit scary for my parents to consider, but they still let me explore and learn how to do stuff. And if there was something that I had a challenge in doing, I could talk with them about it. And I made other friends, and we figured out how to do things. We didn't have a lot of the technology back then that we have today as well, which also made life a little bit more difficult as far as getting information. But even the school district, when I was in high school, had students who would help me by reading me information that I otherwise wouldn't have access to. Probably one of the biggest challenges I had in high school was when I was a freshman. The superintendent decided, and had gotten my first guide dog before going into high school. The superintendent said, you can't take your dog on the school bus because we have a rule, no live animals on a school bus. And he thought that that rule superseded a state law that said I could take my guide dog on the school bus. Well, by the time all was said and done, and my father ended up writing a letter to the governor because the school board supported the superintendent 3-2 and wouldn't override him. My father wrote a letter to the governor, and I don't know what happened, and I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall in Sacramento when the superintendent was summoned to the governor's office. But the next week I was back on the school bus.
With your dog?
With my dog.
Okay.
You know, the problem is people discriminate, and they think that they know what's best when they don't. The biggest problem with blindness and most disabilities is that people haven't really tried them and learned to be part of that world.
Sure.
And it doesn't mean you put a blindfold on for 5 minutes and you know what it's like to be blind. You won't. It's learning techniques. It's learning processes. It's a situation that most people won't learn necessarily to do, but they need to have the faith that it could be done. My wife was in a wheelchair her whole life. She went to college. She went to the University of California at Riverside. Then she got her master's degree from USC. She was a trailblazer in helping to bring accessibility to UC Riverside and other places. We got married in November of 1982, and she lived for 40 years with me, put up with me. And in November of 2022, she passed because her body just started slowing down. As her physical medicine doctor said, the problem is that bodies don't come with a lifetime warranty. But it was a great marriage. People said, well, how can you be married to somebody in a wheelchair? And they would ask her the same thing. How can you be married to a blind person? He can't push you in the wheelchair. Pushed her all the time in the wheelchair. There are ways to do that. And as I love to tell people, she read, I pushed, worked out really well. But the fact of the matter is that people need to get over this idea that just because they may not be blind, they may not be in a wheelchair or something else, it doesn't mean that they don't have challenges. Be in a room sometime and watch the power go out and then see how you get around until you frantically find a smartphone or a flashlight to turn light back on again. You're light dependent, which is as much a disability as anything else, except we've spent a lot of time since Thomas Edison invented the electric light bulb back in 1878 developing light on demand to cover up your disability, but it doesn't mean that it isn't still there.
That's a cool way to say it. You're disabled because you're light dependent. I haven't
Well, you
thought
are.
about it like that. I get it. It makes sense. I would like you, Michael, to focus for a moment on what you would tell parents of children that have recently got a diagnosis or are dealing with a diagnosis or confusion about the delays that their child have or their perceived delays. And so parents are not sure how much they should be that power parent. Like your mom and dad must have been power parents. Your dad went to the governor himself. I love that strength of character of him. But what would you say to parents, Michael, as your advice for them?
You should give your child every opportunity to grow and succeed, whether it's a developmental disability or a physical disability or something that's just perceived, or whether you have the disability in your mind. You need to get over it. The fact of the matter is that every child, every person has gifts. And as parents, you need to let those gifts develop in your child and you need to help encourage them. Yeah, they may have such a developmental disability that they will never live on their own. That can happen. And it does happen. It doesn't mean that they don't have gifts that they can put to use. I have a nephew who has tubular sclerosis. And from a developmental standpoint, he will probably not ever really live on his own. He knows a lot about sports and actually more than I do about sports. And he has other gifts that make him as valuable a member of society. He's now 23, and he has gifts that make him as valuable a member of society as anyone else. It doesn't mean that your child will necessarily do what you think they should do, but you need to learn what they can do, and you need to help them develop and encourage them in any way that they can. Don't say no to your children when they want to explore. Help them explore and figure out what that means, but you can do that. Just don't limit your child. Let your child's gifts develop.
Beautifully said. I love that. And I agree with everything that you're saying there. Thank you so much for coming on today's show, Michael. I really appreciate it. Before you go, I would like to highlight also your book. You have a bestseller. You have a second book that has come out. You are about to be having a third book. Can you give a rundown for, who the books are for? And I will have the pre-order link for the third book in the show notes. Would you give a little summary?
So Thunderdog was 8 years in the writing, and it was really about not only my experiences in the World Trade Center, but lessons that I learned growing up about being blind that helped me in the World Trade Center. And it's entitled Thunderdog, the story of a blind man, his guide dog, and the triumph of trust at Ground Zero. It is available anywhere books are sold, and I hope parents will buy them. My guide dog Alamo says, please buy them because I need kibbles in the morning and at night. So you can help us with that. Running with Roselle was really intended for kids, but more adults buy it than children, and they buy it for themselves to read. It's really more of the story of me growing up and Roselle growing up and how we met. And there's a little bit about September 11th in there, but it's mainly our stories growing up. Live Like a Guide Dog, true stories from a blind man and his dogs about being brave, overcoming adversity, and walking in faith, came out of realizing in 2020, when the pandemic started, that I'd been talking for, at that time, 18 years 18 and a half years about escaping from the World Trade Center and not being afraid. And there were reasons for that because I learned what to do in the World Trade Center. But stories about why I was not afraid were not things that I talked about a lot. I didn't teach people how to overcome fear. The reality is, fear is something that you can learn to control. If something unexpected happens to you, like you suddenly discover that your child has a disability, you don't need to be overwhelmed or, as I put it, blinded by fear or paralyzed by fear. You can use fear as a very powerful motivating tool and a tool to help you keep your senses sharp. You can learn to control fear. So Live Like a Guide Dog uses lessons that I learned from working with 8 guide dogs and my wife's service dog, Fantasia, about dealing with fear and overcoming fear. I'm not going to say not being afraid and not having fear, but rather learning to control fear and use it as a very powerful tool. So it will be published in August. And as you said, you do have the link. So if people would like to pre-order that book, again, we would appreciate it. And I think that you'll find it interesting. It's about, again, a little bit about my life growing up with 8 different guide dogs. And then when with Karen Fantasia, her dog, learned how to be a service dog on her own. And that's a fascinating story that we tell in the book. So it's one that I think people should read because fear is something that is way too prevalent in our society. We got politicians and other people who want you to be afraid, so you'll just listen to them rather than you stepping back and realizing you have more control over your life than you think you do. You may not have control over something happening to you, but you absolutely have control over how you deal with whatever happens to you.
Very well said again. Michael, every time I talk to you, I learn something new. Every time I listen to you speak, I learn something new. I want to thank you for the input you have had in my life. And it's been great to have you on. Thank you for being willing to come on to the Language of Play today and share your story. I know that parents are going to also learn, just like I have, from your stories. Thank you for sharing them and taking the time to write your books.
Well, thank you. It's my pleasure to be here and hope we helped.
You did. Absolutely. You did. And thank you again.
Thank you.
Hey parents, I hope you found this episode helpful. If so, would you please take 30 seconds and share it with a friend who also lives or works with children? I would really appreciate it if you would leave a quick review for the show on Apple Podcasts. I read every review and it lights me up to know that this show is making a difference. Then come join my Facebook community, where you'll meet other parents who are dedicated to helping their children grow too. You'll find the link in the show notes. Thank you for joining me. Now it's time to go. Let's pop our kiddos in the strollers and go look around outdoors and see what we have to talk about.